Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Welcome on Smart Sustainability. What does policing in the 21st century look like? And with that, what's the future of policing in Fairfax County? Our topic tonight. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. The definition of policing in the future is a hotly debated topic. People of all skin colors call for police reforms and less police brutality. Police reputation and people's attitudes towards police officers and vice versa are at the heart of concerns to many citizens. Trust is an issue. The role of police is an issue that brings up the question of how to bring the need for community and humanism on the one hand and law enforcement on the other together. What could that look like in Fairfax County? Something to talk about tonight. With the Chief of Police of Fairfax County, Kevin Davis. Chief Davis served as the City of Baltimore's Police Commissioner from 2015 to 2018. He previously served as Chief of Police of Anne Arundel County in Maryland and Assistant Chief of Prince George's County Police Department. Also joining us tonight is Shirley Ginwright. She's the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust and someone who's seen history from many different sides. Welcome both of you on Smart Sustainability. Great to have you on.
Thank you, Nicolette.
Thank you.
Chief, I'm going to start with you. So policing in America is undergoing a major transformation. I think Fairfax is not an exception. We're part of the community. There's a whole movement going on. A lot of our institutions generally and establishments right now, as very often in transformation, have to go through and review and see who were we then, who are we now, who do we want to be going forward. Fairfax not being an exception with that. And I think that also applies a little bit to the personal journey. So my first question is, when you look at what's the correlation point between Kevin Davis as the policeman of the past versus Kevin Davis seeing as the policeman of today? Where do you see this intersect?
Well, Nicolette, that's a great first question, and thank you for having me on your show. So my 30-year personal journey in this profession has mirrored the journey of policing in America. And I think when you talk about transformations, and they happen in pieces. When I first became a police officer, that's when Rodney King hit, March 3rd of 1991. So that sparked a conversation. I wouldn't say it necessarily inspired a ton of reform during the 1990s, but when you fast forward to 2013, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in New York, Freddie Gray in Baltimore that I lived through. That was really a moment when the conversation started to kick into a higher gear. And then George Floyd in the summer of 2020 was a game changer. That murder was a game changer. So the transformation process and expectations, and they're just not community expectations, Nicolette. We, police leaders, police officers, we believe in those things too. We believe in reform. Reform's not a four-letter word. We want better training, better education. We want to interact with communities, particularly communities of color, in a way that garners trust. So we stand shoulder to shoulder with people like Shirley Ginwright to try to make things better.
Yeah, that's why I actually think that reform isn't really the right word, because I think we live in a time, the 21st century, that is all about transformation for all of the things. I think it looks at the role of the citizen, it looks at the role of the community, it looks at the role of all these different establishments. So I think transformation really is a little bit further reaching, and I think there is more to it, because to me reform looks more like repackaging, but that's not what we're talking about.
And I think a lot of police officers think of reform as something's wrong with them.
Yes, that's right.
Well, something's not wrong with them. It's something we have to do better for the profession. And in the 1990s, the policing strategies in big cities and big counties was more law enforcement oriented than it is now. We know that there's things like co-responders, a phrase that didn't exist back then. We know that we have to do better with folks who suffer from mental illness or suffer from behavioral crisis, developmental disabilities. Those conversations, Nicolette, were just not happening in the 1990s, and I'm thrilled that they're happening now.
That's right. Shirley, a question for you. So you've, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've seen history, through a long time. I mean, you marched with Dr. Martin Luther King, you went through the civil rights movement. You've seen also the policing of the past from your chair where you were sitting at the time to today. Talk to us a little bit about how do you see your understanding of what you've gone through of the policing of the past to where you see today in Fairfax that we're actually morphing into or moving towards?
In the past, I would say, and especially let's talk about Fairfax in general.
Yeah.
I don't see the same things that have happened in Fairfax as it has in other cities. So I would think we are much farther ahead in the reform or the transformation than others are. I would say if we look at the killing of George Floyd, that is very much akin to what I would have expected 30, 40 years ago. But with body cameras and phones with cameras, we can now record everything. So now other cities are saying we need to reform, but as the chief say, it's not a reform, but it's a transformation that we need to go through.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about the highlights of your personal journey. I believe I went to one of these meet and greets. I learned a little bit about you. What are the areas that you worked in your police career that you would say have shaped your outlook towards the future in the most way, or in a highlight where you really say, we may have to change our way we look at things?
Well, Nicolette, about a decade into my police career in Prince George's County, just on the other side of the river, we went into a court-mandated consent decree with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. So that was my first real exposure to how we should be doing things differently. We were very much a traditional enforcement-oriented police department.
What do you mean by that, if I may ask?
Arrests, enforcement, hyper-focus on crime. Now, crime is important because behind every crime is a crime victim. And I think our criminal justice system is best served when we are victim-centric. But we were considering all of the other ramifications of an enforcement strategy that over-incarcerated inside the Beltway majority African American and Latino communities. So I think when we became aware that our enforcement strategies were actually driving a wedge between the cops and the community, we realized we had to do things differently. We had to become more evidence-based. We had to really drive home what constitutional policing is and isn't. Sometimes, when I first came on, the bulk of the training you received was your first 6 months in the police academy. And then throughout the rest of your career, you got little to no real enhanced additional training. So now we realize that the police academy is just the beginning of a journey. So relying on technology, relying on best practices. I will say this about my profession that I really, really love and am proud of. We have come such a long way in the last 30 years, and I'm unaware of another profession who has come as far as we have in the last 3 decades when it comes to hot topics like diversity, inclusiveness, and even now, Fairfax County, and Shirley Ginwright knows this, and she's been a big proponent, and she's one of the reasons why it happened, procedural justice training and implicit bias training. That's happening in Fairfax County now because of empowered, and I think that was in your introduction, empowered community members like Shirley.
Yeah, very, very definitely. You have something to add on this one, Shirley?
I pass.
Okay,
I've never heard Shirley pass. That's the first time. She'll come back.
Oh, no question about that. So I found this very interesting when I looked through your background. you went out of the police force to join a tech startup. And to me, this is really interesting because it seems it's almost like night and day. You operate in two different worlds, one that's more rule-based and procedural-based, and a tech startup. My God, if there's anything out there that's about rule breaking and going with the flow and looking ahead and figuring out how to change with change. How did you navigate this to an extent? And then how do you think this will help you to apply this today for navigating the future of policing in Fairfax County?
So, Nicolette, two things kind of happened to me when I finally left policing after nearly 3 decades. And now, of course, I'm back. But that's another question. So I leave policing for the first time in my adult lifetime, and I had exposure to two things that I had never been exposed to before. So I'm leaving the paramilitary police department with rules and structure and policy. And I went to work for a Boston startup company, and I think the CEO was 38. The president was 30, and here I was. But I met these folks because they, like many other people, came to Baltimore to see how they could help after the riots and the unrest of 2015. So I got to meet some really interesting people who wanted to use more technology to help us be more evidence-based. So we didn't have to rely as much on hunches and suspicions. We could do what we do, but based more on facts. So I met these folks, and I served as their chief security officer for a couple years. So while that was happening, Nicolette, I was also selected to be a fellow with the Open Society Foundation, which of course you and your listeners know that's George Soros. I was the first police chief ever to interact with the Open Society folks. And I was exposed, not that I had not been exposed to advocates, because I certainly had that experience in Baltimore, but my fellowship was me, a former police commissioner in a big city, and a lot of advocates, and also a lot of former Obama administration officials. So that was a period of growth for me as well. So.
Oh, I bet.
So I grew a lot. So now that I'm back in uniform, I do have, I think, a better, broader perspective on what's going on.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I think there's also a couple of other elements that can wave into that. So we talked a little bit about your experiences in the tech world. Tech world is all about data, as you know.
Yes.
You talked about saying that data really would help with the police, which I think it does. But there is another aspect to it, and I heard you say that before, actually. Data isn't the end of all the things, so to speak, but it's how the data is interpreted. And I think that's actually a big issue for most people and also most companies, because I think at this point we have actually almost data overflow, which leads very often to a bottleneck versus really seeing what do we do with the data and how do we apply it in a useful way.
Right.
How do you see this happen in terms of where can we use the data? Where can you use data more, technology more in policing? And then how do we make sense of it?
So I have a couple different thoughts on that. And as you're saying data, I'm going to say data. So potato. But my exposure to the data world in the startup community is it has to be meaningful and it has to be real time. It has to be real time because you have to be able to do something about it now and not retrospectively. So data examination in American policing often comes right of boom. So we'll have a negative incident, we'll have something bad happen, and then we will retrospectively go back and examine data that we should have been looking at real time so we could have prevented something from happening that distances the cops from the community. So we just hired a PhD by the name of Dr. Noah Fritz. His first week was last week. We did a national search. Fairfax County Police Department did a national search for a data expert. Because, like Shirley knows, we have a University of Texas to San Antonio report. We have disparate impact and interactions with the cops in Black and brown communities. We need to do better with officer health and wellness so we can become aware of red flags when they occur. So Dr. Fritz, who I imagine at some point in time may be eligible to be a guest on your show.
Okay, I will definitely.
He's very interesting, but he's going to put data in front of us real time, but meaningful data. I think too much data for the sake of saying, look, we look at data all the time, results in paralysis by analysis.
It does, exactly, because there's a bottleneck. Nobody knows what to do with it.
I don't want to know 100 things, I want to know 10 things.
That's right.
And I want to know those 10 things right now.
Yeah, exactly.
And it also, if I can interject, it also depends upon who is actually analyzing the data. Different people have different reasons why they want to get the information.
Absolutely.
And depending upon what their objective is, they can screw it either way they want to.
Yeah.
But I agree with the chief that we too often get data that is 3 or 4 years old. And then we want to try to make it fit for today, and that does not work. Even the Texas report, that's old data. So how do we use that? And we're going to be looking at some of their recommendations. Well, some of their recommendations we may have already done.
Yeah, and Shirley, that's true. So we're looking at 2016, 17, and 18, and here we are 5 months away from 2022. So Ms. Ginwright has a great point, but we need to be able to look at it real time, and that's where we're going to be. And Fairfax County is going to lead the way because, like Shirley said at the beginning of your show, we are not in a crisis with our community in Fairfax County.
Yeah.
We're just not.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying really hard to get better. So I'm excited about the fundamentals, the blocking and the tackling, right? I use sports analogies sometimes and they're imperfect, but we block and tackle really well. But we can do better. And if we can look at data real time and the right people look at the data, because I think Mark Twain many years ago had an interesting quote that I can't say on your show about data. But it's got to be the right people looking at data and applying it in a way that's consistent with the expectations of the community.
Yeah, I would agree with that, actually. And talking about data, to use your pronunciation, there's very often this thing that we need more and more data. But I like to refer people to Copernicus. When you go back, the Copernicus had the same data as all of his peers at the time. And when he changed from a geocentric worldview to a heliocentric worldview, the only difference was that he looked at the data differently, and he put it differently in context. And I think that's what finally made the big push through. Let's talk about where we are in Fairfax. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to interject again.
Yeah.
Having access to the data also, and the chief had mentioned earlier in one of our chief sessions that he wanted to be able to have that information on our website, so it will be accessible to the community. And that was one of the problems that we run into often with advocacy groups, that they cannot get access to the data that they need. So this will help eliminate that concern and that problem that we've been having for so long.
Yeah. And Nicolette, it's the crime data, it's the use of force data in particular, and officer health and wellness. We got to be able to look at it now.
So is this then like a dashboard? Is there a certain transparency? Is there almost like a dashboard for us citizens in the community who can look at this?
There will be. We are about to announce who we have finally selected to be our records management system vendor. Yeah. So a couple exciting things, and this might sound like it's inside baseball, but a new records management system is coming to Fairfax County that's cloud-based, and because it's cloud-based, that will eliminate the silos. And we have a PhD, nationally renowned leader, and police CompStat, government CompStat. He's been in the field for 40 years, and he's going to get us to the next level where the dashboard for the community and the cops is real time. What's going on right now in July? Not what's going on in July of 2020. Because July of 2020 was a lifetime ago when it comes to both crime, use of force trends and patterns, officer wellness. Yeah. So it's an exciting time, and we're going to figure it out.
Yeah, it is, and as I used to say, when you look at reform or transforming things, you really need to look at the things from being able to change with change at the pace of change, and that only works if you have real-time data and if you have access to it and you can actually evaluate that. So let's talk a little bit about Fairfax in terms of when we compare. I'd like to contrast it a little bit to see if that's possible, to see what was the policing of the past, what was kind of like, what would describe it best of the past towards where were we then, where are we now, and where are we going?
Okay. One of my observations throughout 3 decades is police departments across the country, and there are 18,000 police departments in America. We were hyper-focused on our productivity. Sir Robert Peel in 1829 said, and I'm paraphrasing, that the effectiveness of policing is best judged by the absence of crime and not by overt statistics about law enforcement. So I think in the 1990s, and it was really, Nicolette, the crack cocaine epidemic that exploded across this country, particularly big cities and big counties. And we're right next to DC. In the Rayful Edmonds days in the late 80s and the early 90s, crack cocaine epidemic, violence exploded. So elected officials and police chiefs up and down the East Coast and on the West Coast and some places in between began to judge the effectiveness of their police department by the number of arrests, by the number of traffic stops and citations, by the number of person stops, by the quantity of drug seizures, the quantity of gun seizures, the number of search warrant executions. So we got confused a little bit. And we would pat ourselves on the back if our enforcement went up while our crime went down. And that didn't always go hand in hand. But I think we realize now that if we, and I'm not speaking for anyone but myself, but if we would have treated the crack cocaine and heroin in places like Baltimore explosion 30 years ago as a public health epidemic instead of a public safety epidemic, I think we'd be in a much different place in 2021.
Yeah, because then you would prevent more of this, and it would have gone down. And I guess this is the case that we're realizing. I think that in many areas we've been focusing so much on productivity, and that was the only means of measuring, versus really seeing what's the actual role, and shouldn't we get to a point where we then have actually less crime and less people, and where we could feel safer in going out, where we feel you can just act differently and focus. What do you see as some of the major issues ahead that we need to focus on?
Well, in terms of the crime fight, I'll say the fear of crime. So violent crime is spiking in many jurisdictions across our country right now. In Fairfax County, we actually have twice the number of murders this year than we had last year. Still a very low number, but we're still talking about human beings who have had their lives taken. But our overall crime is down about 14.5%. So most people are surprised to hear that, particularly when we're adjacent to jurisdictions that are having an explosion in violent and property crimes. So the challenge is to police in a way that's consistent with the expectations of our community. We have to treat people with dignity and respect. We have to. But we also have to reduce the number of crime victims and prevent crime. And then the other piece of it is there aren't enough hours in the day, it seems like, to me at least, on many days, for us to fit in all of the transformational things that we're doing as a police department. And I mentioned procedural justice training and implicit bias training, but we're bringing a use of force training, that's the gold standard, called ICAT to Fairfax County. And ICAT stands for Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics. And really what it means is it's de-escalation on steroids. It's using time and distance to your advantage. It's tactically repositioning yourselves. And then we have the data, the effort. So, and then finally, again, not enough hours in the day, is the co-responder effort that I'm really excited about Fairfax County's, the Board of Supervisors, the chairman, all the way on down through the county executive. We're gonna have a co-responder model in Fairfax County that's gonna be the envy of places across our country, because we need to police that way because we interact so often with people in crisis, and the co-responder model will take us so much further.
So how do we envision that as citizens? So then if there is a crisis, is there a faster interaction? Is there a different way the police will interact? How do we see that?
So the co-responder model puts mental health providers and police officers in the same car together. Now, we don't have 1,459 mental health providers to get in all of our cars, but we look at calls for service and times of day and geographies, and we figure out when is it optimum for mental health providers to ride with our police officers. So when that call for service goes out, and it's someone suffering from a mental illness or a behavioral crisis, that will at least have someone who's a professional on the scene to hopefully interact with that person in crisis. And we think we'll have better outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to introduce, Nicolette, our mental health providers to danger. But once a scene settles enough, that mental health provider on scene is a heck of a lot better than the mental health provider being at the back end at a hospital. So it's really the way to go.
I do want to touch on an important point. And you mentioned it's important that we treat people with respect and dignity. And I think that is actually a point that interests most of our viewers. I'm sure you at home, you're interested in that very much as well. I always wondered, so I'm European, I've always wondered when I came here, I've observed there is a difference between how police treats people in the United States versus how police treats people in Europe. And I was always curious in asking about this. Why is it that in the US, it seems there is a much bigger power gap in between people and the police versus in Europe? And I give you an example. I was terrified when I came here. And I know, I'm European. I was terrified at my first encounter with American police here in the US, because it seems that there was, the way it happened and the way it came across, it seemed there was not much room for understanding of the circumstances of the situation. And it was a simple thing. It was a traffic violation.
Sure.
But there was very little understanding in terms of the police officer, in terms of what the situational moment was. And in Europe, for example, you can actually talk to a policeman. You're not afraid, you don't feel threatened. You feel that you can talk like just like regular and explain like a normal person and explain what's happening. That wasn't the case in the US. So I always wondered, we don't throw people on the ground. We don't, it's just not a European thing. So what is that makes police, first of all, here, the gap between people and police so much bigger than it is overseas? That I think that's probably at the heart of that.
Well, the gap is closing. It's not as wide as it used to be, but it's a heck of a lot wider than it is in the UK and throughout Europe. So you'll be happy to know, Nicolette, that the ICAT, use of force training, is a UK training model. So the Police Executive Research Forum, headquartered right down the street in Washington, D.C., took a group of folks in 2015 over to the UK because it dawned on us that force is used less often throughout Europe, but particularly in the UK. So we studied the UK. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. The culture, American culture versus European culture is one thing. And without getting political at all, there are more guns in America than there are people. So
it's a more violent society, I suppose.
Yes, the likelihood of running across someone with a firearm in Europe is not nearly as great as it is in the U.S. And because of that, policing is a little different. But the takeaway with ICAT, a UK training model that I introduced to Baltimore in 2016, results in force being used less often. And then you introduce, in America, the body camera. And Nicolette, just the other day, we had a police-involved shooting. It was our first police-involved shooting ever in Fairfax County that was captured on body camera. So that means I get to the scene, and within minutes, I can watch it. And I can watch it with my own eyes and hear it. And I can make a much better assessment on the use of force that was used. So we are closing that gap. The gap is still too wide. And then another exclamation point is the history, the 400 plus years of history in America with the African American community. We obviously didn't get that right many, many years ago, and we still haven't fixed it. But that conversation is well underway, and we're trying our best to close that gap.
Shirley, how do you see this evolve? So when you look at, I mean, I'm European and I was terrified. I cannot even imagine or begin to imagine what this meant for African American communities. It seems to me it's a really long journey and trajectory. How do you see this evolve and finally coming closer to making this gap smaller between a power gap, I like to call it a power gap between police and the people, and also increasing the trust and I think a normal way of talking to one another?
Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things with the training that in Fairfax County our officers are going through, but the implicit and explicit biases and procedural justice, but it's also looking at a person as being human. Mm-hmm. You're using some of your home training when you walk upon a person, just saying good morning or having a casual conversation. Mm-hmm. I realize everyone have a bad day, but you don't have to take it out on someone else. I think also there's some officers who just feel that if you break the law, they're the police officers and you listen to what I say. I don't want to hear what you say, but we're changing that. And that has to be changed, not just in Fairfax County, but all around the United States. It isn't just the African Americans that are not looked upon as being human, but it's many of our immigrants, especially our undocumented immigrants who are afraid to say anything. Yeah. And we have some immigrants who have come from countries where the police are so terrible and they're terrified of them. Mm-hmm. So when they face them here, now they would put them in the same situation. Mm-hmm. So trying to look at person, a citizen, as a human, another human being. As they say, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that's what all of us need to learn. Whether we're in a uniform or not, treat a person the way you want to be treated.
Well, Nicolette, and I think I've already shared this with Ms. Ginwright. On Labor Day, we're embarking on a new community policing program called IPAC, lowercase I, and then uppercase PAC, integrating police and community. And what it is our police officers will be required 30 minutes every day to simply get out of their car, because the police car is such a barrier, but it's necessary, to get out of their car and simply talk to human beings. No enforcement, just talk. Now we're going to attach some training to that, and I'm going to sound old when I say that the younger generation needs training, but we are going to introduce some training by what we mean by that, because typically police officers will go through an entire tour of duty and only interact with victims and suspects and reporting people and witnesses. But what about everybody else? What about, like Shirley said, good morning, the weather, sports? I mean, what about all those icebreakers? And it might take people aback that a police officer said, good morning, how's your day going? But that's sad. That's sad.
It is.
But it's going to be IPAC, a half an hour a day, required. We're going to measure it. Yeah. We're going to partner with a local university to do before and after polls to see if it's had an impact. But we realize, like Shirley said, that we have to become more approachable. Yes. And the only way to become more approachable, like the cops are in Europe, is to get out on foot and talk to people.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I think it's also very important to address that power gap a little bit, because I think that's really at the heart of the matter. So it's more of an equal, here's the community resident, and even when a person, not everyone is a criminal, just because something happens. And I think that's really something that really struck me, that I think what I've noticed or observed is that there is very often an inherent, you're guilty when someone gets stopped or something, versus asking what actually happened.
Well, Nicolette, the power gap, I have two thoughts on the power gap. Number one is we need to hire more black and brown police officers, more female police officers. We're not where we need to be. With gender, 16.5% of our police department is female.
What's your goal?
Versus 12% nationally. The goal, which I signed, good question, we took a 30 by 30 pledge. And 30 by 30 means 30% of our police department by 2030 should be females. So that's the goal. And we can do it. But that same goal needs to apply to young people who don't look like me, who are born and raised in the Mount Vernon community.
Yeah.
We need to take our recruiting to the street. And then another thing that I did, that we did recently, is we changed our grooming standards on the Fairfax County Police Department. And that's not necessarily breaking news, front page of the Washington Post, but we now allow our male police officers to wear full beards. And our female police officers can wear a ponytail. They can wear braids in their hair. They can wear twists. Our police officers can wear tattoo sleeves as long as they're not obscene. So we need to interact. We just need to, be in a position to, hey, we look like you look. We reflect you, not only by race and by gender, but by hairstyle, tattoos. I haven't got my first tattoo yet.
I was going to say, if you had one, can we see it?
But these young folks have tattoos. They just do.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'll come back on your show when I get my first one.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I definitely. You heard this, so we will bring the chief back when he's got his first tattoo. There we go. That's a good one. Let's talk a little bit about the hiring, because I think that's also, it seems to me, is that a challenging part right now with the hiring of younger people? Because I can imagine with all the things that are going on, the dangers that are put out there for someone who actually goes into the police service. I'm sure moms have a say in that too. And then also in terms of attracting talent these days in general is not, it has its own challenges for everyone. Where do you think you're going to find people for this kind of job, or what is your pitch to younger people? What would you like them to know to come and join the police force? Well,
I guess number one, the elephant in the middle of the room, every police department that I know of is having challenges recruiting police officers.
Yeah.
We're down over 100 police officers in Fairfax County. We've never been down that much before. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's not just one reason, but one of the reasons is the national scrutiny. And I think folks look at our profession, we should be scrutinized because we have to do better. And I think there's some apprehension there entering our profession right now, but we need people right now. And during my 2-year hiatus from policing, in addition to the tech world and in addition to the fellowship, I also taught a couple classes at American University and Catholic University. And the majority of my classes, and this is where my own bias came into effect, I thought I was going to get majority young men in my classes. There was a majority females. So there is an interest in young people, particularly females, in joining public safety. I'm not sure how that's going to play out over time, but we need a more diverse workforce, but we still need to find a way to attract people to us. Yeah. What do you think is the primary motivation for someone to join, particularly those young women, for example? What do you think this is they want to be part of? Well, hopefully it's public service. Yeah. So we and others, when you look at police recruiting videos, and if you go to our website and visit other websites, you typically see the things you see in the movies and television, the SWAT teams, the guys and gals rappelling out of helicopters, and K-9 and the Marine unit, and homicide, and all those things are really important, and we have all those things in Fairfax County. And we're big enough as an agency, Nicolette, to attract people who want to come to a big department, and they can do anything. They really, really can. But hopefully people are taking on this vocation because they have a heart and a capacity to serve others. That's my hope. And we need to do really thorough backgrounds, and Shirley and I have spoken about this before, to ensure that we're attracting people to our profession for the right reasons. I don't want narcissists. I don't want bullies. I don't want people who want to wear a badge and a gun so they could take it out on others. And get trigger nervous. Yeah.
Nicolette, if I can add to that. We have in Fairfax, and we've had for years, what they changed the name to public safety cadets, the kids from 14 to 21 who have an interest in policing. But we need to find a way to keep them so we can move them from high school into the academy. But one of the things the chief and I talked about is, and you mentioned about how do we get the younger kids, is having in Fairfax a public safety academy starting in the 10th grade, similar to the ROTC program, where we can take these kids through the 12th grade, give them a scholarship to go to school for 2 years, and then bring them back into the department. And at that time, they should be close to the age in which they can go into the academy. But we're going to have to start grooming and growing our own. And that's what I look at it as, growing our own. And then we can also get the diversity that we want, because we can pull students from different schools and different cultures and different religions. And that's where we want to be. We want to be inclusive. Talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to be included. Everybody is included.
And Nicolette, I've, not jokingly, seriously, call that the Shirley Ginwright plan, because it is, and it makes sense.
Yes.
It makes sense because we talked about, Shirley mentioned the public safety cadets.
Yeah.
They used to be called explorers, but we have 90 of them. 90. That's a big number. But like Shirley said, when they hit college age, because we can't hire them until they're 21, we lose them. So the fire department, I love the fire department. The fire department can hire them when they're 18.
That's right.
So we have a gap in there,
Yeah.
and I think what Shirley's plan does is it fills the gap and give them a little bit of money, help them out with their education, help them out with their tuition, and embrace them and get them in this police family earlier.
Yeah. Now, talking about this a little bit, what do you think are some of the key characteristics? So you mentioned before you don't want people who are narcissists, etc. What would be some of the key characteristics that you would be looking for that you think someone who joins the police force for today, for policing, for the future, would be the right mix?
So it's impossible to measure this, although some might.
Most of these things never are,
Right.
but what are some of the characteristics?
Compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
Compassion and empathy. Now
Yeah.
we do a psychological evaluation for all of our police officers, and
Yeah.
I've mentioned this at a couple communities of trust meetings. We need to add a behavioral assessment on top of the psychological evaluation, because the behavioral assessment identifies those narcissistic personality tendencies. But empathy, compassion, and exposure to cultures different than your own.
Yeah.
People who look differently. I was born and raised in Prince George's County inside the Beltway, and I've led 2 majority African-American jurisdictions. So my exposure, as a white male, 4th generation cop, to people who don't look like me has something that I've been around for well over 50 years. But we want to be careful when we bring someone on the job that we're not exposing that person to things that are totally outside their experiences.
Yeah.
Now we have to treat every candidate equally as well, and there's a process for that.
Yeah.
But we need to do bigger and better things with recruiting. We need to recruit differently than we do now.
Yeah, and I think one of the big challenges is also because we have now become such a melting pot, even more so than before, with the diversity and inclusion and the different language skills and the different understanding and the different cultural backgrounds. And I mean, so many things can happen in the blink of an eye where you just misunderstand a situation, whether that's you as a citizen or whether this is on the side of the officer. So we all have to learn to get to a point where we address this in an open way and learn from one another, so we actually can make sense of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of folks in Fairfax, and I've heard this growing up in the DMV, in the National Capital Region my entire life, is Fairfax County is one of the largest, safest jurisdictions in the country. And the police department here enjoys a national reputation. And it's a really, really good one. But how can we make it better? Because there are a lot of folks, men and women, professional staff sworn on the police department who know that we're pretty good.
Yeah.
We're more than pretty good, but none of us are satisfied with that. How can we get better? And overwhelmingly, that's the sentiment that I've been exposed to since I've been here. It's exciting, and it's an honor to be here.
So how would you describe the role of a policeman or a policewoman of the future in Fairfax County?
victim-centric. I mean, we have to care about people who are victimized by crime, and we have to prevent crime and disorder. That's our core responsibility. But the manner in which we prevent crime and disorder is the topic. Do we treat people the same regardless of their geography and their skin color and their gender and their sexual orientation? That's where we need to go. So, of course, we have to prevent crime and disorder, but it's the manner in which we deliver that to the community that is the topic of conversation. And I'm convinced that our profession is on the right path to getting it right. And I'm also convinced at the same time that there are only a few police departments in the country that can pull it off. And by pull it off, I mean have the political support, the community support, and the resources to do it. Fairfax County, Virginia is one of those places.
Okay. Now, Shirley, question for you. How do you see the communities of trust figuring into this construct of having to actually changing the attitude a little bit of, for example, the African American community, which has, I think, their own well, I don't want to call it bias, but everyone has a bias. Bias, by the way, isn't something negative. I will have to clarify that. Bias means brain's instant assessment of a situation under the experience we've had. So the question is, how do we change the attitude, those personal biases that we all have, everyone in their own communities, me being a European, African American, how do you think the communities of trust can actually help with this process to change the attitude, to take out the fear factor, and to make this all a much more integrated and smoothing way of operating?
Well, I think we've been doing that for the past 6.5 years when we started. And one way is getting into the community. And the chief's plan is to have each of the officers now get out of their car and actually interface with community members.
Yeah. Where
before we would actually have listening sessions where we would go into the community with law enforcement and listen to the members, what are their issues, and then have a response and actually go back to them with whatever the issues were, and then try to figure out how do we resolve that issue with the community. Because the community has to be involved in correcting whatever is wrong in their community. They have to take ownership, and then they have to give back as well. It isn't just on the law enforcement.
Yes.
But once we get all of them communicating and talking and respecting each other, which I have definitely seen a big difference since communities of trust has been established. So we're going to just continue doing what we have been doing, but maybe just pump it up a little.
And Nicolette, it speaks to One Fairfax, the countywide initiative that's not just police-centric.
Right.
So what One Fairfax is doing throughout, at least the county government, is ensuring that there are not only expectations in place, but there are policies in place that demand the type of things that Shirley is speaking to. And in policing, it's relatively new that police policies include things like a requirement for intervention. That was a conversational expectation, I think, most of my career, but it never made its way to an actual policy. So we're taking our expectations, the things that we know we want, and we talk about it in the parking lot, in the hallway, but we're now making them policies, and we're holding our own folks accountable for making it happen.
And Nicolette, another thing that we're doing in community trust, we have what we call educational seminars.
Yes.
Because when we have policies that are changed, then we'll give a seminar for the community and have someone from the police department come and talk about those changes and how it impacts the community as well within the police department.
We did that for the pursuit policy.
Yeah, we talked a lot about what the police is planning to do. We talked a lot about what the communities of trust is planning to do. There are a lot of different initiatives. There's training. There's webinars. You have the different hiring processes. You're training people for implicit bias. So you're doing a lot of things. Let's talk in those last 8 minutes that we have left. Also a little bit on what can citizens actually do, because as you said, Shirley, it's always a two-way street, right? So what can citizens do to actually get to a point of approaching the police better, of opening more up? What can we do, particularly here in Fairfax, to make this a smoother process and to get closer? Who wants to take the first step?
The same thing we're asking the police to do, we should be asking the citizens to do the same thing. See a police officer as a human. They can walk up and say good morning or good afternoon and start a conversation with a police officer. And I don't think it should be any different. Yeah. Respect each other. When we have community events that involve police officers where we're trying to pull the communities together, then I ask that community members come out. And if you don't come out, then don't complain about what is going on if you didn't come out to find out what happened or to be a part of it.
Yeah. And I think to add to what Shirley just said, communities across the country are saying, don't paint us with a broad brush.
Yeah, they're all different.
Don't do that. Yeah. But you know what police are saying? Don't paint us with a broad brush either. Yeah. So we're both saying the same thing. And we're not at odds with that. So I think one saying that I've always been fond of with communities is know us before you need us. So with IPAC coming up and with these events that Shirley has historically put on to bring the cops and the community closer together, they are know us before you need us opportunities. Because when a community really needs us and is in crisis, if there's been no interaction, it'll start from a not so good place.
Yeah, and actually that's an important point that I think also for our viewers to know, because I think that makes perfect sense, because if you, even in terms of a crisis, then when you know a department, when you know how to go with it, when you feel more comfortable, you have a much more personal relationship, the fear factor is taken out, you can actually do something about this. And I would like to invite the audience, because I know there are a lot of events actually that the police puts on where you can go to, you can attend, you can visit, you can ask questions, and they're pretty transparent, and everyone is invited to ask a question, whatever is on their heart or on their mind, and then can put it out there. So how many more are coming on this one? I know you've had a series. I've been to one as well.
Yeah. Well, there's always
Is it ongoing?
I've got 3 events this week.
Yeah.
So I think communities reach out to us. Take advantage of community leaders like Shirley, because sometimes the relationship with us is more of an art form than it is a science. Just ask, and we'll be there. Don't lament the fact that we've never interacted with you or your neighborhood or your community, because maybe you haven't asked, or maybe we haven't extended the offer.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's like ships passing in the night. We got to talk to each other more often.
That's right. So talking about this, so the next 100 days, what can citizens look out for or should have on the radar for things to look for in terms of your plan, in terms of being engaged, in terms of just being in the know of what the police is doing? Well,
that's a lot. And I'll boil it down to maybe one thing for folks to look for who are watching your show.
Yeah.
I'm hopeful that all of your viewers have an opportunity this calendar year to have a non-enforcement, non-crime report opportunity to interact with the police officer. Mm-hmm. And I'm hopeful that the police officer is the one who initiates that conversation with you. Mm-hmm. So if you see that, that means we're doing the right thing. Now, we're going to do things with the crime fight, we're going to do things with policies and procedures and the trainings that are going on. But if all of our community can expect to have a positive interaction with a cop in the very, very near future, I think that tells us we're doing something right.
Shirley, do you have something to add on this one?
Well, I haven't talked to the chief about this, but Okay, Chief, this is what's coming down the pike. Just like we just had, to me, some very successful Meet the Chief sessions. In the future, I would like to see more of the listening sessions in the different communities. It doesn't mean that the chief has to be there, but we have commanders in each of those communities. And that's what I would like to see more, and invite the communities to come out and meet their commanders, because a lot of them do not know who the district commander is.
Yeah, and I think that's great, because by Labor Day, and this isn't a big surprise, but by Labor Day, we're going to make a lot of promotions, and there will be several new district commanders. So that's a great way to kick off that relationship.
Absolutely. Now, on a personal note, what would you expect as the biggest challenges for you? Because I'm sure, you know, when you go through, I know actually I've worked in transformation for a while, so I know it a little bit. There's a lot of different moving pieces. So on a personal note, where would you see your biggest challenges going forward?
Well, I mentioned earlier, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, about not enough hours in the day. There are so many things we have to do. There are so many different training, transformational training opportunities that we have to deliver to our police department. So finding the time to do that while keeping the community safe, because every time you train police officers, you're taking them off the street to do it. So it's a constant challenge to find the time to have the appropriate training to ensure transformation continues. And the best training that I've ever been involved in are scenario-based training. Not necessarily classroom training, but scenario-based training. And that takes a little bit more time. So it's a challenge. It's not insurmountable. We're doing it. We're finding a way to do it. But the support from the community here in Fairfax County is wonderful, and I'm sure it will continue.
So if you had to describe in 3 adjectives the policing of the past versus the future of policing, what would you choose? For 3 adjectives for the past and 3 adjectives for the future, to boil it down.
The future, collaborative, the past, enforcement oriented. So you put a hyphen in there, that's one word, right?
Yeah.
For the future, diverse. For the past, not so diverse. That's more than one word.
That's okay.
For the,
Qualifies.
I'm trying
to.
Adjective. So for the future, compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
In the past was more. I don't know how many of your viewers remember Joe Friday, just the facts man, more objective. You know, and again, a lot of community policing used to happen in the past too. It's not like it used to not happen, but it wasn't an organizational expectation the way it is now.
Yeah.
Like my own dad was a community-oriented cop. He never knew he was, but he was.
Yeah.
So it's an imperfect answer to your great question, but compassion and empathy.
It's perfectly good. Thank you very much. We're actually almost out of time. We're wrapping up. Thanks so much, Chief, for coming on. Thank you, Shirley, for being with us. I do encourage all of our viewers to really go and check in with the police. I think we've heard really some great tips on what we can do on our end, actually, to facilitate that dialogue and get a little closer, and closing that gap to get on a more even keel, to generate sort of a community that we all want to live in, and in a safe and in a healthy and in a great environment. Thanks so much for watching. We see you next week. Have a good night.